Okay, just a few quick ideas here. Post-structuralism does not exist in my opinion, and yet it does in a strange way. This seems very paradoxical, or something to say the least. In the same way that postmodernism relates, what's the word I'm looking for, to modernism, post-structuralism is, okay, I'm going to confuse this train of thought, but just stick with me. Post-structuralism is kind of seen in the same way as sort of being the antithesis of structuralism or what's going on. In a way, it's the same kind of dynamic, but in a way it's not, because postmodernism and modernity are two different things, but they're totally interrelated in a way. Whereas post-structuralism, it doesn't exist. I just have to kind of put that out there just to get this idea across. It's the problem with post-structuralism is it's just not defined enough, and it's kind of like you're questioning, is it an evolution of structuralism, or is it the antithesis? And that's it. That's the whole crux of the matter. It just doesn't get past that. You know, we'd like to think it does, and then there's almost this enigma about that no, that's where it stops. It's not decided, and it just doesn't really exist. Basically, it's just kind of like the residual modern version of structuralism. It's kind of trying to do what postmodernism did to modernity. But modernity is an era, it's a vast epoch. Structuralism is just like a phase of intellectual theory or whatever. So whereas modernity refers to history, structuralism is just kind of thought. It's cerebral or whatever. And post-structuralism, it's just kind of the whole soup of thought that comes after. It's almost like the whole soup of thought of anything that you can't think of. If it doesn't fit into postmodernism, then it must be post-structuralism. But basically, it's nothing. It's kind of like you're thinking something's supposed to come after structuralism, but no, it's like the lingering ethos of structuralism. Okay, now, very important, deconstruction. Like, I haven't done all the research. I haven't read any Derrida, but it's like 30 years later, I got this figured out. It's like Derrida, he was just like, he was a showman, like Picasso. He's like the Picasso version of a philosopher. Picasso was not that deep. And yet, there's this enigma. It's like by being not so deep, he actually is very deep. And that's kind of the whole cyclical, paradoxical vortex that's going on here. And in a strange way, that's exactly the very thing that, not the very thing, see, it's paradoxical, so it's really confusing. The very thing that Derrida seemed to be pointing out is kind of what I just realized, the thing that he's sort of criminal of, but not really. He's actually, rather than falling into categorical thought or into stereotype, he actually creates a myth and a fable. I just realized that just doing the research, that just when he could have simplified deconstruction, he kind of turned it into a paradox, almost to protect it or to try to elevate it into something else. Or maybe he was just really clever, and I think he was kind of a trickster. He just wanted to see if he could send it into some enigmatic realm of immortality. But I think I could clear it up really quickly. Deconstruction is half the process, and I am inventing the new ism. What's the word? It escapes me now. I'm claiming the name for it. Welcome to, or no, how do I say it? Okay, bottom line is reconstruction. And he kind of was, I think he was kind of trying to say that deconstruction is nothing without reconstruction, or he was kind of trying to say that you can't just take everything apart, or you can't even take it apart if you want to, because you need to keep the meaning, you need to move forward, you need progress, you need reason, all this kind of stuff I'm inferring. But what I'm saying is that it's just totally nonsensical. Like, the only reality is, it's like the whole point of deconstructing something is to get it down. Like, what Derrida is a genius for, in my opinion, is that he was just like trying to say, look, it's all, the context is more important than what the words mean. And that whole little train of thought is just totally laden with paradoxes, because it gets into the whole confusion of language and words, and it just, like, when you think about what words mean, and then you think that they mean, you know, opposites of things, it just becomes a vortex of paradoxical thought. But to return it back to the realm of reason and reality, is that we just, like, he's the genius for basically saying that it just needs to be torn down to a level playing field, because that is what's honest. There's all these different meanings and perspectives, and what's honest is just to tear it down to the bare bones. But what he stops there, or his life ends there, so to speak. What the reality is that it's the reconstruction that we need. You got to tear everything down to the bare bones, so that you can actually move forward with an accurate definition, or accurate response to life. And it's not like you're supposed to get stuck there at the point of being deconstructed. That's totally ridiculous and passé, and it's just so old school. Like, it's just pointless. But I don't know what Derrida was trying to do, but I think, like, he kind of, I mean, I'm just like evaluating my opinion of him, because I kind of thought he's like this just total genius. Like, the first time I heard of Derrida and deconstruction, I was like, man, this is exactly it. I don't know why. I was just like, this is exactly it. Now it's like 30 years later, and I'm like, why didn't people understand him? What was the problem? Or why did he create such a confrontation? Because people misunderstood that exact thing, that he was just trying to tear everything down. But then the weird thing is that all he needed to say was so that we can build it up. We need to tear it down so we can build it up. But it just gets lost there. It's just like, oh, we need to tear it down. Like, that is the point. But then he kind of, by my just most recent research of, like, right this minute, it's like he kind of left it there. It's almost like I felt this to myself. It's like when I'm making art or painting, it's like you get to the point of a paradox and you kind of like fall right into the hole, and you almost don't know what to do. It's like you can't all of a sudden see clearly, because you're too much into it at that point. And yet the weird paradox of that is that if you just take one step, like I always, like with paintings, it's like do a bunch of stuff and then just shelf it for a year, because when you come back a year later, you see it so clear. And then it's like, but when you get into paradoxes, things get really complex, and like it's like this vortex of stuff. So the thing is, you can't see it clear, and I think that's the point he got to. But he was enticed by this idea of turning it into an enigma, where it was kind of like like he's kind of trying to say that you can't even define it. Like the whole point of deconstruction is kind of saying you can't really define words. But that's not really what he was saying. He's just saying you got to tear it all down so that you can look at what it is honestly. As I was saying, to build it up again. But he didn't really say that. I just added that to it. What he was kind of trying to say is you got to tear it all down so that you can look at it accurately. But the implication is to build it up again. But he didn't really do that. And when he could have, if he would have taken a year away and taken a look at it clearly, he would have said the other half is so you can rebuild it, which he didn't really do. And what did he do? He kind of got stuck in the vortex, and he saw a little bit of maybe his own mortality or immortality and said, you know what, I'm going to throw a curveball into it. I'm going to do with it the very thing that I'm trying to unravel is all this confusion. I'm just going to throw a bunch of confusion on top of the idea. So it's kind of like, oh, so you can't tear down the word deconstruction because then you're deconstructing it. Kind of like it's hard to even explain it because of the little bit of a that's how paradoxes are. It's you get into that little bit of a vortex and you just can't quite get it out there because it's fascinating. It's to me a paradox is like a riddle, and I've always been fascinated with the idea of a paradox, but in a way it is a bit of a troubling vortex. But when you think of it, it's like a riddle. And again, riddles too, kind of like in that same way as a paradox, they kind of confounded me. Like I was like, one day I thought riddles were just the coolest thing, like when I understood what they really were. But then all of a sudden, it does that exact same thing as a paradox. It just becomes this vortex. And then you kind of can't remember exactly what it was. And then so you almost have to forget about it. And when you forget about it, you're thinking, well, it's just riddles. And you kind of remember, like, I thought riddles were really interesting when I thought about them long and hard one day. But then it's like, you can't think about it that long. You just can't think anymore. So you have to shelve it. And then you put it away and you kind of forget what riddles really were when you understood what they really were. But what, coming back to that idea, what riddles are is riddles are kind of paradoxes. But really the end game of all this stuff isn't total confusion, isn't total absurdity. Even the theater of the absurd and all this stuff, it's actually just a more delayed or deeper or protracted way of getting to meaning. Again, we're stuck. What's the term? We're destined to get back to meaning, progress, moving forward, rebuilding, whatever it is. That's my opinion. So, and now here's the thing. As soon as I look into Derrida, it's just like 2 or 3 ideas. It's like, okay, first thing I come up to is like, why is he always applying it to language? That's a real curveball. Like, the brilliance of it was like a flash of illumination to me. It's like you're applying this to life, right? Like, yeah, of course, language, but it's kind of, why are you applying it to, text? Why are you applying it to text? I can see how text could be used as a way to, as a model, but it's a theoretical thing that applies more to life, not to just textual reading or whatever. So that just always screwed me up. And as soon as I try to research Derrida, that just throws me off right away. It's like, why? It's like this great revelation, but it's like a philosophical epiphany, but it's a theoretical outlook on life. So, or it's like more like philosophy. So why just limit it to a reading of text? Like, that's just, it's not really even paradox. It just seems like weird, or like it's just pointless to limit it to this sort of like microcosm or whatever. It doesn't make sense. I just can't get past that. That's where I start to think that, like, Derrida seems to me like he was like a pseudo-intellectual or a pseudo-philosopher. It was like he was kind of having these epiphanies, but he didn't really even know what to do with them. And that's where I kind of think he was like Picasso. It was like Picasso was kind of like, when you think about like Cubism, what was Cubism? Cubism was really a return to primitivism, which is like, he was looking at this African sculpture that's kind of like abstract, and it's just like he reinvented mask making, and this whole, instead of like making pictures that look like reality, it's just more like making idols and stuff. So like there's like spiritism. There's kind of like Picasso tapped into this spiritism. It wasn't like about geometry and mathematics and all this kind of like intellectual thing. He's more like tapping into spiritism, and he doesn't even really know, but he knows that spirit. It's like a fashion, like a trend. It's like a spirit that blows through, and it's like you catch onto it because you know it's hot, and you know that's what everyone wants, and that's what Picasso did, and that's what Derrida did, and people that are artists or aesthetic people or into fashion, they see these things coming before other people, and they tap into them quickly, and that's kind of part of their genius. They're actually like, it is a paradox because it's this whole idea that they're both deeper and more superficial. And that's why I'm skeptical of myself as an artist and stuff, because I realize that. So I think Derrida was like that. He had a few of these principles that he just didn't really seem to resolve very much. It's like, it doesn't seem like he looked at it very deeply. But at the same time, where he didn't look at it deeply, it kind of seems like he had a little bit of a flair for showmanship, or I don't know that much about him, but it seems like kind of like he was a fairly popular or whatever, like kind of, yeah. He seems like a really interesting sort of personality, but at the same time, these few ideas are kind of seem to be contradictory and kind of prevent deconstruction from really being that deep in a way. But the other thing is that I just don't really know some of these basic principles in philosophy that people already are accustomed to, and yet because I didn't study philosophy, then I don't really know them. Like, I didn't study it academically, so I'm a little bit behind, so it's kind of hard to say. But like when people are talking about binary opposites and stuff, like that's the other part that Derrida throws me off. It's like, I'm not sure exactly what he's talking about. Anyway, I was gonna kind of go off on a tangent with that, but I think that's it. I just don't know. And what was the other one? So now I lost it. I think difference. Like the idea that a word isn't what it means or whatever. That whole idea is kind of a paradox too, but it's basically, and I'm not sure if that's exactly what difference is meaning, but like I think it's kind of like saying, the context is actually more important than the words, but really it's not. But then what I gave is this example of, it's like more like, think about an argument. Like in reality, or I mean in normal situations, the words do mean kind of what they are, what their definitions are, and we communicate on a rational level with that. But what happens is, in so much of like let's say in a heated debate, or in a dramatic situation rather, or let's say an argument, like whatever, any of these sort of more dramatic ways of speaking, which are very, very common too, are actually, those words totally don't really mean that much anymore. It's like, let's say, if people are giving orders or whatever in the military or whatever, it's just like, it's way more about the whole context. It's like, if you string a bunch of words together, that means you know, like you do this and that, or there's going to be trouble, or like whatever. And it's just like there's all these other emotions flying around when things are linked together in a certain way. So in all those emotional settings, the words are just garbled. It just, who cares? Like, people don't even think about the meaning of the words. It's just all these emotions flying around. So in those more emotional situations, which are pretty much as common as the normal situations, like you think about average day, there's as much drama as there is peacefulness. So in all that dramatic emotional speech, the words are basically meaningless. It's all about the emotions, it's all about the drama. But then we go back to relaxed conversation. We're like describing, it's like, okay, yeah, I was driving there, or it's like how to do this or that. And one person's listening to the other person, and it's very logical and rational. But as soon as it gets more emotional, then those words are kind of just like a bunch of strings of commands or whatever. It's like, you do this, or I did that, or whatever. And it's all these triggers. It's like all these ideas are triggered by saying certain words, or it's like timing and all. There's all of this stuff that, like, all of a sudden the words don't really mean anything. It's all just emotion. So this is what I think difference refers to, but whether it does or not, I'm not sure. But what I'm saying is that the general idea is that the context is more important than the word. But what I'm saying is, no, it's not. It's just that kind of seems that way because there is so much drama, there is so much emotion. But no, let's be honest, the words mean what they mean generally most of the time. But then because there's all this emotional stuff going on all the time, words very quickly slip out of their dictionary definitions and become more like a language of emotions. And so that's just one example. Then there's all these other things. Then there's like historical ties, customs and traditions related to words, where like words have meanings related to historical things or philosophical things or psychological things, or what all these other, not just emotional or dramatic things, but then there's all these other realms that words go into that can also color or influence what they mean. So words have like definitions and etymologies, but then they have all this baggage, or they have all this emotion, or all these different things. So there's so many different things that can affect the context, where basically you could say that the context is more important than the words. The words are just kind of like the vehicle, and it's really the context that colors or influences what that a given word means at a certain time. It's like a swear word. It's kind of like it's, you know, it just means something, or it's like a religious word, but because it's spoken in anger, it doesn't mean religious word. It means the opposite, actually, like a curse. It means like evil to you, or evil at that, or it means like anger at that, or it kind of means this idea. It doesn't mean a religious term. It means an emotional concept or whatever. So I think that is kind of the crux of deconstruction, but in a way it's kind of the failure, because again, it shows how language becomes very slippery. So language is a great example of where deconstruction as a field of thought, or as a theoretical thing, is so relevant. But at the same time, like language, you know, can show just how slippery reason, or the basic, the simplistic reading of something is. to the extent that the idea doesn't matter, just the context matters. So language is a great example for this, but you could also say it's probably the greatest example of that because we use it to communicate, but it shouldn't be the deciding sort of factor in it. It's just more or less a good example and the best example at the same time, but it is more about the way of thought that permeates society. It's the theoretical implications are equally important or more important or very important. I don't know which one, but definitely I think that can't be excluded from it. And so I think that I'm reiterating that, I guess, but it's sort of the point where deconstruction is kind of both related to language, but in a way it has nothing to do with language. Just kind of trying to emphasize that point. And it's kind of, again, there's a bit of it almost gets into that paradox again, because as I'm thinking so much, I'm speaking, and it's just like the whole confusion of everything